I am going to dive in and introduce our panelists, and we've got a lot to talk about today, and so we're gonna dive right in. I do see that we have a very large audience of attendees today, so we are thrilled to have you join us. Thank you for taking the time out of a busy school day. And before we get started, I do want to encourage you to make use of the question and answer feature of the GoToWebinar. So on your GoToWebinar control panel, there is a section called questions, and I encourage you to submit questions throughout our conversation that I will keep an eye on and work into our conversation as it makes sense, but we'll also have a dedicated time at the end to do Q&A based on what you're curious to learn more about. So do make good use of those questions. So with that, as I mentioned, I'll be moderating the panel today. I am a former educator and founder of Kickboard, and with me I have 3 panelists on air. I'm pleased to welcome Elizabeth Greene of Cohen College Prep in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Hi.
Hi, Elizabeth, and you'll hear from Elizabeth in a bit. She is the testing coordinator, data specialist, and math department head at her school. We're also pleased to be joined by Kristen Morin, who is the community field coordinator at Greenwood Leadership Academy, which is a turnaround district school in Boston Public Schools. Kristen, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Karina DiGirolamo, who is the Director of Curriculum and Instruction at Equitas Academy Charter School in Los Angeles.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So just to create a brief amount of context here, why have a panel, why have a webinar about data and decision making in the first place? Data-driven decision making is certainly a buzzword in our field today. So what can we expect to talk about, and what do we hope you'll learn or take away from today's conversation? So first, teachers have access to a lot of numbers, but I think we'd all agree that the data only reveal trends if you know how to effectively analyze it. And when teachers are well prepared with best practices for analysis, you as a staff can really uncover some of the most actionable issues with students' performance and growth, to celebrate gains, to celebrate growth in a school year, as well as identify and correct setbacks or roadblocks. And when it comes to data, setting meaningful goals is actually the most critical step. To step back and ask, what are the questions that we want to find answers to, can really drive the decisions around the data that you want to collect. And so with that, we'll tee up our first question to the panel, which is just around setting meaningful goals. And so I'd like to open it up. I may direct questions to each of our particular panelists at some point, but want others of you to just jump in and add to the conversation. Talk about what it means to set meaningful goals at the start of the school year. Is there somebody who'd like to kick us off there?
Sure, I can start. This is Karina. I think that, in the beginning of the school year, we really try to look at setting meaningful goals for the whole school, for specific teachers, and for specific classes and scholars. So to start off with, we really look at a comparison to similar schools, and then also to what we call the high bar schools, which are high performing schools in our area. And we really try to identify the areas where we have the most significant potential for growth. And then based on what we identify, we make very specific goals for each of our grade levels and for each of our subjects. And so, for example, one of our goals this year for English language arts in second grade is to have 90% students proficient and advanced, and 0% at far below basic and below basic. So it's very specific goals that really allow us to know where we're trying to get to in the end. And then we really, make these goals, we make everyone at our school aware of these goals. And so we post them, the leadership team knows about them, the teachers know about them, the scholars know about them, so that everyone is really on the same team and aware of, what we are trying to achieve.
Great, thanks, Karina. To add to that, maybe this is a question for Elizabeth or Kristen. How do you set, in light of that, how do you set goals for what needs to happen this week versus that larger picture of what needs to happen in a school year?
This is Elizabeth. I can probably answer what we do at my school currently for that. I think for a long time we would really rely on our interims and our benchmarks every 6 weeks to really see whether or not we were making progress towards our goals. And there was a lot of disconnect for teachers between what they were doing on a daily basis and what was showing up on those interims. And so one thing we've really been trying to push teachers to do is having a weekly reflection where we look at our grade books and we look at the standards that we taught, and we really look at what specific skills did kids master and what specific skills did kids struggle with, and sort of what is the root cause of that struggle on a weekly basis, with the intention of all of those smaller skills adding towards a larger understanding of a standard that will allow them to be successful on our year-long goals and our big benchmarks and interims every 6 weeks. So really it's taking the time, and it's really planning intentionally assessments that will allow you to have good data to see, okay, on a daily basis, maybe they understood the skill on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, but Wednesday there seemed to be some misconception. I really just need to focus in on that particular piece of a standard as opposed to reteaching the whole standard when I see they struggle with it on the benchmark. So that's one thing that I have seen lots of teachers moving towards that seems to be really successful in having a more intentional approach to instruction on a weekly basis.
Great. And Elizabeth, one of the hats that you wear is within the math department. Is this something that is just focused on math, or is this, are these practices something that you're doing across your school? Tell us a little bit about that.
I am the math department head, but I also, because I do really love numbers, actually help all parts of our school work with data, including English, science, social studies, and even our electives in art and PE and those sorts of things. And really the biggest push is making sure teachers are creating assessments that really test what they care about. What piece of a skill do they really feel passionate? As long as a kid understands this piece, then they're really going to be able to master the standard. And then once we really establish like that strong sense of how to create a good assessment, we're sure that the data that we're creating is actually useful. So it does look very different in English and social studies and science, but if you create really good, strong, tailored daily assessments, whether it be a checkout or an exit ticket, then that data is going to help teachers inform their instruction no matter what subject they're in.
Great, that's helpful. And certainly questions that come up often is, how do you make this work across all departments? So I think that's an important lens to look through as we continue our conversation. So as you think about, moving from the goal setting into step 2, which we like to think of as making observations, Kristen, a question for you, to continue the conversation is, after setting goals, making really informed and useful observations of the data you're capturing is the first step in analysis. What insights might you share about how you go about this at your school?
Well, I'll first say that in order to make useful observations, the data has to really be in your face, and it's something that teachers need to be seeing on a daily basis. So what we've begun to do this year that we didn't last year, and I've definitely noticed an improvement in teachers' familiarity with the data in order to make those observations, is we've posted data kind of everywhere. So we have a huge data wall in our office where we post our standards mastery once every 6 weeks. So this allows teachers to see how we're doing as a whole. It gives you a really good big picture, but then also we have the groups, so different interventionists can come up and see how their students are doing. Teachers as a whole can see how their students are doing. And I think it kind of lures people into looking a little bit deeper. So once we've made data visual, the other thing that's really helped with making these observations is making the time. And then following a structured cycle that works. So what we like to do is we like to make predictions first. And I feel like that really helps to invest teachers. So what do you think will be the outcome of this assessment? Where do you think your students might struggle or get tripped up? And trying to get teachers to think in the minds of their students. And then we move on to the observations, where I feel like it's really tricky to remain in the observation area and stay away from making inferences. So we have a couple sentence starters that we use, like I observe that, some patterns or trends I notice, or I am most interested in. That kind of keeps the discussion based on what's in front of you as opposed to the reasons why it's happening. And so I think that those are that's how we really build our capacity to make insightful observations. And then we practice a lot. Jen, are you there?
Yeah, I was just going to ask Kristen. So I think that's interesting. And before we move on to another question, I think that word practice is really fascinating, right? So as adults, as educators, we'll often talk about practice at the student level and often not reflect on, well, what practice do we need as adults to build skill in using data? So, I know that a lot of our audience is thinking about how they can really create or foster this kind of analytics culture in their buildings. So tell us about what that practice looks like and sounds like and feels like. Is it a lot of faculty meetings? Is it one-on-ones? How often are you meeting? That sort of thing.
Sure.
The picture.
So I think we set aside sacred time for data, and in our whole school PDs, where after a formative assessment we'll all get together and have time for grade level team observations and conversations so that they can lead to planning. We also, our math coach and ELA coach will also meet with teachers one-on-one in addition to our principal to facilitate those discussions and try and guide teachers through that thinking if they're having a hard time. But mainly it's emphasizing the importance of data and then using whatever time we can to really hone in on what's happening with our students and the mastery levels.
Great. Karina or Elizabeth, feel free to jump in. Your thoughts or your perspective on how you practice or build in that sacred time for using data.
Yeah, I think that we really have tried to focus on the action plan. So, after we make these observations, how are we going to set aside time to actually make an action plan for what we see? And so every 6 weeks when we do our interim assessments, we really set aside a full PD day to actually look at the data and then plan out an 8-week action plan based on what we're seeing. And so I think the key piece there is that the curriculum is tied to the data, which is tied to our goals. And so really making that connection between those three things, and then really giving the teachers time to make that action plan and revisit that action plan, whether, based on what the data is telling us.
Great.
Can I add one more thing? This is Elizabeth.
Great.
One thing about the practicing, I really agree with the last speaker about the importance of the action plan and focusing on that. One thing that we found really successful in particular with the fact that different departments and different subjects tend to view data a little different and struggle with it more in some departments than others, and like how to really use it. And one thing while we've been making action plans we found really valuable in our practice is working together and being really collaborative and sharing when we feel like we've really been able to understand and pull out good observations from data, showing how we came to those observations and sharing what kind of conclusions we drew from them and kind of what our plan is, in particular across like curriculum, so that, you know, we can see a social studies example and a science example, so that I think a lot of times if we only have one person presenting and we just are like, this is exactly how you do it, some teachers sort of feel like they're doing it out of, oh, I have to fill out this template, I have to fill out this action form. And so really trying to create a culture of collaboration. We're really practicing trying to get meaningful information from data as opposed to just doing a task because it's part of our PD.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And as a former educator, you know, I think back to all the times that, you know, I looked at my students' performance on one particular assessment as a moment in time. And I think what's really interesting about, you know, what you are describing is that it's an ongoing process. And so to that end, you know, Karina, you and I have talked before about how data analysis can involve noting trends over time. I'm curious, and I think the audience would be curious to hear, what role does growth play in your analysis?
So we've made a really concerted effort to focus on growth this year. Last year we would teach different standards each week and provide intervention for those who did not master the standard. However, we weren't able to see growth from week to week, and we really found that that intervention loop was never being closed since the scholars were never reassessed, except for, you know, the use of exit tickets. But we really wanted to see that growth. And so this year we've moved to using 2-week intervals for each of the standards taught. And so this really allows us to analyze where the students are during the first week of instruction, and then also get a growth percentage to how our intervention is working. So if a scholar is not able to master a standard the first week, you know, we reteach it to them during intervention and then retest them on that second week. And so it really provides us with the ability to see that growth from week to week. And then it also allows us just to see the growth as far as, you know, different reading groups, different subjects. And so we've really found that model to be helpful for us this year.
Great. And feel free to our other panelists to jump in as well. So I think as we move forward, you know, one thing that I heard come up earlier was when you start looking at data, you start by making predictions and observations and hold off at least initially about making those inferences. That being said, one of the most powerful benefits of data is its ability to help uncover problems and root causes. And so Elizabeth, I'd love to direct this question to you. Once you've made observations, how do you connect the data and ask the right questions to figure out, you know, what exactly is at play with a student's performance?
Yeah, I think that's often one of the biggest challenges I see teachers run into, in particular when we're looking at data from like an interim or a benchmark. And so we kind of do it, I often push teachers to really do it kind of in a tiered system. So first we'll look at like our benchmark scores, and if we see that there with particular standards students are struggling with, you know, it's sort of our natural instinct to be like, oh, it was a bad question. Oh, it was worded funny. Oh, it was confusing. Oh, the kids were a little off. They didn't really try that hard. And really, so we'll first try and target on a bigger assessment, like a benchmark or something, and then we'll look back in our grade book and really try and see, okay, the kids struggle with this on the test. What did it look like when they did it on exit tickets? What did it look like when they did it on homework? What did it look like when they did it on quizzes? And looking at those scores and looking for a trend. And if we maybe see a trend on homework but not on exit tickets, we can look at, okay, how was the wording? Was it in the presentation of the question? Was it that there's actually a common misconception? And for my school in particular, we found the most success of really being able to pick that problem apart is really actually in almost the planning of how we're going to save our information over time, and really making sure we're not just putting in a general state standard of, you know, grade level expectation number 10 which is like really overarching, but instead we're going to break it down into a sub-skill of every piece we care about. So when we go back and look at a standard that a kid messes up on an interim or a benchmark, we can say, okay, they actually understand these 3 sub-skills of it. It's this one sub-skill is what's tripping them up and making it so that they're not feeling that success or showing that growth on the benchmark. And if we really tackle that one particular piece, then we can probably see a lot of growth. And we've really, really been trying to push ourselves to take that extra time, to put in that extra work of creating really detailed assessments and routines for keeping data that gives us a lot more information than a really generalized standard from the state.
Interesting, interesting. So I think like in the next step, we'll cover this issue more broadly around coaching teachers at your school to ask some of the hard questions, Elizabeth, that you just gave examples of. The questions around, possible causes of students' misconceptions and barriers to learning. Kristen, do you want to take this one first in terms of coaching teachers?
Sure. Well, actually, this is kind of where we're at right now in our phase of creating this analytics culture. Getting teachers to ask those tough questions and to be really reflective about their practice. So one of the things I know we do is the why, where when teachers, like Elizabeth said, it's kind of your natural inclination to say, well, that was a really bad question. But then you ask yourself, why? Well, I didn't have time to write it, or I didn't write it before I wrote my lesson. And so it didn't necessarily probe at all the things that I wanted to get at or a specific sub-skill that I wanted to measure. Okay, why? And so continuing that process to really dig deep into the problems of our practice and where we can kind of change routines or restructure those systems for teachers so that they can feel confident in their data when they have it, that it's measuring what it's supposed to, and that they have a better understanding of what's really the cause of the student underperformance, if that's the case.
Interesting. Other thoughts that Karina or Elizabeth you want to chime in with?
Sure. I think we try to keep it, really simple for the teachers and try to get them to focus on, of course, the strengths, the challenges, and then, like Kristen was saying, really get them to the place where can we restructure. So focusing on small, tiny pieces that they can tweak in order to change the trends that they're seeing.
Yeah, I just want to agree that it's really important to make sure that the changes that are made are bite-sized so that teachers don't feel overwhelmed during that process.
Interesting. So can you speak a little bit about what you mean when you say bite-size? I think often when you join a webinar like this, we'll often hear from our audience, and actually I can see it in some of the questions that are coming in, and continue to write in questions. Audience, this is great. But when you say bite size, like what does that really mean? Is there any way you can give example of some of those bites or baby steps that you've taken over the past year?
I know for us it is something small. So for example, if we're seeing that, for example, we saw that our students were having trouble with long division. And so I sat down with a teacher during a coaching session and talked to her really about her exit tickets, and what she was doing at the end of the long division lesson was she was giving an exit ticket, and she would divide them into they got it or they didn't get it. So she had 2 piles. And then she was working with all the students who didn't get it after in intervention time. And what we realized was that it would be great if she would be able to separate those students who didn't get it into a more specific area. So for example, she started to separate them by the students who were having trouble with just the multiplication mistakes, or students who were having trouble with just the division mistakes, or just the subtraction. And so she was really able to go in a little bit deeper and make a specific plan. And so that was a very simple tweak that she was able to apply the very next day in order to really make sure she was getting at what the students were missing, instead of just an overall intervention for long division, which is not necessarily what each student would have needed.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, and I think hearing and learning from examples of, you know, sort of those small tweaks that really can pay dividends is really helpful. Are there other ways that you can speak to, and this is, you know, for everybody on the panel, other ways that you worked with your teachers to uncover, you know, sort of uncover the root causes and really dig into the why students might not be mastering the content or the skills that you're teaching?
Jen, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on examples right now.
No worries.
This is Elizabeth. One example, I mean, there's lots of things we look at when we look at data, but I think one thing when I'm working with a teacher who has maybe taught, you know, a concept, for instance, one of my teachers was teaching probability for about the third time. You know, the students see it in Algebra 1, and she's their geometry teacher, so they were seeing it again, and they just weren't getting it. She did a reteach, and they still were just really struggling. And so really looking at, like, at that point, is it the questions, or are we really teaching to what really matters within the questions? So really sitting down with her and taking time before she reassessed of, in order for students to be successful on this assessment, like, what are the key concepts that we really want them to be able to say, and really pushing teachers to be clear on not like adding in too much extra information, but really being clear and concise and efficient in the way that they're teaching a concept to kids, and teaching it in lots of different ways and ways they're engaging. But a lot of times students can get confused on an assessment if the teacher taught them a bunch of extra information and didn't really teach them to look at a question and really figure out, you know, what matters. And so I think really when we're seeing a lot of times where teachers are reteaching and then reassessing and reteaching and reassessing, and there's still not growth, really looking at, like, what is in the presentation, what are we messaging to kids to focus on, and how to find access to that. And a lot of times when I've sat with, in that particular instance, when I sat with that teacher, we really hammered out, you know, what words exactly are we going to use to always describe this concept and tie it all together. Kids were incredibly successful when we reassessed the final time.
Fascinating.
I think just to add to that, we also, you know, we'll go back to lesson plans and really look at, you know, what exactly are we going to say and script it out. And then in our coaching sessions, we'll also provide the time to practice it. And so, you know, I'll play the student, the teacher will play the teacher, and, you know, use the exact words that they're going to use, because I think sometimes there's that drop between we put it into the lesson plan and this is how we're going to reteach it, but there's no time to actually practice it. And so if it is something like Elizabeth was saying, like a scripting, you know, of a question that what we really want to get at is actually having the teacher practice within the coaching session.
Just to agree with Karina, what Karina was saying is, like, hands down what I found to be most effective with teachers who are struggling with that reteach is just having them, like, practice on another adult of, like, explain it again until it makes sense. So yeah, Karina, thanks for explaining it better than I could.
This is the benefit of having many voices of wisdom on a panel. So I guess along those lines, I think it's helpful, Elizabeth, you mentioned a couple of examples from the, you know, kind of discipline of math, and I often wonder what that looks like, or if it looks different within some of the other subject areas. Thoughts on how you know, how you use exit tickets to collect the data, how you go about analyzing, you know, kind of the causes of student understanding in some of the other subject areas?
Yeah, I mean, so I've been working pretty closely with both English, social studies, and social studies teachers about like how can we make data more useful for them. And one thing that we've really stumbled on is, in particular in the English department, when they're looking at something like a paper and grading a paper, and like how can we really make that data useful. And a lot of times when I talk to English teachers, they really focus on creating a rubric, and that the rubric kind of shows the things within the paper that they care about, whether it be like the mechanics, and then like the ability to have a clear thesis, and then, you know, what about the flow, and having all these pieces of the rubric. And so in our grade book, we have teachers use the same rubric whenever they give an assignment. And so like grading on that rubric and using those almost as each piece of the rubric as a sub-skill. And so maybe after multiple papers, we see, okay, a kid's getting a B or a C, but really he's really strong in these three areas, but it's this one category, mechanics. It's really just tripping him up. So rather than having him rewrite every paper, really just focusing in on tutoring that kid on that one specific thing. Some teachers have even been able to kind of expand that out to their checkouts, where like in social studies, if we're talking, and particularly in social studies because it's so much about like facts and stuff, on the high school level, when I'm talking to like the AP US history teacher and stuff, when there's sometimes when he cares about the fact, and there's other times when he cares about like the connection or the importance of the fact, and kind of almost giving like a double score and creating data in a way where it's like, okay, is what's tripping the kid up the fact, or is it why the fact is important, and kind of having a double score and always keeping that data double and looking at what is really the root cause of the kid not getting the ideal score that they want. That does take like a lot of work and foresight and plan to really be able to kind of keep those numbers on what actually matters, and really trying to develop that before you go in. It's hard to do after you've already given a checkout and now you're like, ooh, what number should I write down so that when I look back I know what matters. So those are some of the examples of how I've seen it in English and social studies.
Great. So maybe the next step, which is really the final step around data analysis and action planning, is so we've talked about action planning in our conversation a couple times, but just to really focus on action planning for a few minutes and dig into that, I think will be helpful. And just a quick note to all of those in our audience that have continued to submit questions. We're building up quite a bank here, and so I look forward to having a really rich Q&A. And don't stop. Keep submitting your questions based on the things that you hear our panelists saying, and we'll have a really good Q&A session towards the end. But on that note, you know, as I mentioned, taking action is that final step in the data analysis process, and ultimately what we're building towards, because having numbers or having data just for the sake of looking at that data is meaningless. And yes, the earlier steps inform the intervention or the action that you'll take to improve student performance. And so it's important to think about this as a continuum. Along those lines, Kristen, what questions do you ask to empower teachers to take action based on their data?
Well, I think we start small, and generally that just means on a level where teachers don't feel the pressure to correct all of the standards where students didn't perform as well as they would like. So even just starting small with something like, you know, what concepts are your students working on in general? And then especially within that, specifically, what concepts are different groups of students working on? Where are they struggling? And creating those groupings kind of first and foremost. And then the next step is kind of connecting the standards to those concepts, and making sure that teachers have a good understanding of what those standards are asking, and then translating that to kid-friendly ways of expressing it so that the kids can actually articulate what it is they're learning, why they're learning it, why it's important, And so keeping all these things in teachers' minds so that as they're creating their action plan, it's something that's really useful and very practical for their practices the next day in class. And then looking through those groupings and kind of trying to specifically target when will we, when are we going to meet? How often are we going to meet? What group, how am I going to reteach this, or do I need to do a mini lesson? And then designing the assessments that go along with that, all kind of ahead of time. So these are all different components of the action plan that once we get those questions started, I do see teachers really taking it on, and it gets them going and gets them kind of fired up to start creating that plan.
Great. And I think, certainly the big question on my mind, as well as, others listening in, is it can be a really, kind of inspiring or energizing feeling to walk out of a day-to-day or a faculty meeting or a professional learning community meeting with, a detailed plan of action. And then the very next day you go back into your classroom and maybe that action plan, ends up on your desk or in a binder, that sort of thing. So to our panelists, maybe to Elizabeth first, how do you, in your role, how do you follow up to make sure that interventions or reteaching efforts are working?
Yeah, I think that's something we're still, as a school, really working through, and we've kind of put some things in motion that have been beneficial this year. I think in the past, I've definitely been at other schools where, I make my action plan and then no one looks at it and I don't even use it, and it does kind of feel useless. So one of the first things we do is when teachers create their action plans is we have them all put them in a shared folder on our shared drive, so that their coach or their direct supervisor can look at them and send them some comments and really just be like, I really like that you noticed this. Have you thought about this? And just even that little interaction of, I looked at your action plan, I'm going to ask you about it again. Just that little bit of someone else cares about this besides me has really, I've seen, have had a large impact on whether or not our teachers actually put some of those steps into action. And then sort of the next piece is knowing that we have access to those action plans as we do our weekly coaching meetings and we sit down with teachers and we talk about, whether or not they're feeling ready for our next interim or for whatever. We'll check in with people. On our action plan, we actually have a calendar where they say what they're going to reteach and when. And so checking with people and saying, you said you were going to reteach this. Did that happen? If it didn't happen, how can I support you to make it happen? If it did happen, how'd it go? Just really being a thought partner and giving people, making action planning and responding to data an activity that is taken on by the staff as a whole and not by just individuals who are alone in their classrooms, I think has been probably one of the most powerful things we've been able to do, is really just making it something that we all do and that we all support each other on. And that we hold each other accountable to, and that we don't judge if we're not able to meet it every time, but that we push each other and support each other to find the time and to have the willingness to stop what we're doing and really intentionally go back and reteach when our kids need it. So those are some of the things that have been successful with some of my teachers.
I would have to agree with Elizabeth. We also follow up about the action plan during our weekly check-ins, and I think that's really helpful for our teachers and also for us just to be able to touch base about it, remind them about it. They remind us about what they're doing in the classroom, and I think in part of the action plan, putting it on the calendar I think is really important. So what we do is when we're making the action plan, we go back to our pacing plan, which is our, we call this scope and sequence. And so we really make sure that whatever standards we're saying that we're going to reteach, we go back and put it in our pacing plan. And then that pacing plan is used then to plan lessons. And so it's already in there. That's part of the action plan, is to go back and put it into our overall plan.
Terrific. I think that's really helpful and certainly something that brings all of these different steps to light in that, you know, it's ultimately all about what you're doing with this data. So I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and I know we have a good bit of time for some Q&A, and I'm going to move into that section for now. And while I wish we could answer all of the questions, I'm not sure we'll have time for that. But feel free to keep them coming as I throw questions towards our panelists. And just to answer one quick question that's come in from the audience a couple times, yes, we are recording the webinar, so we will follow up through email with a link that you'll have access to stream or to download it and listen to it again, as well as we're consolidating a number of these questions to ask to really build a thriving analytics culture at your school, and we'll share that out after the close of the webinar as well. So if you're scrambling to take notes of everything that's on the slides, don't worry, you'll have a chance to access all of these materials after the fact. So with that, let's dive into some audience-generated questions. And I'm just going to ask and leave this open to our panel. So the three of you, anyone feel free to jump in here. So let's start with, a question around time. Time is always on our minds when we talk about limited time in a teaching day. How do each of you on the panel find time during your teaching day to sit down and talk about data with your colleagues?
Sorry, we have scheduled check-ins with our teachers, and so I meet with half of the teachers each week, and our dean meets with the other half. And so we have scheduled 30-minute meetings with every teacher, and so that's where we're really able to dive in and talk about it on a daily basis.
We have a very similar approach as well, where they're built in at the beginning of the year and kind of change as the year goes on depending on needs, but for the most part they're blocked out.
For this is Elizabeth, we have a similar thing where we meet once a week. I think the hard thing that we've run into, I know as a coach, an instructional coach personally, is normally during that time, like, we end up debriefing an observation, and so one way that I've made sure to bring data into that is on the rubric I use for observations is putting in a spot where I specifically tie something to data, and so like just making a routine of we're going to talk about observations, we're going to talk about concerns of kids, but we're also going to make sure to bring in that data piece and check in on the action plan. And progress towards that, and just making it a routine, something that's expected from both the teachers and from me, has made it a lot easier to maintain throughout the school year.
Great. Zooming back out to year-long goals. Question about Common Core. So how have you all set concrete goals for this year when there's a lot of ambiguity around the Common Core assessments that students will face at the end of the year? How do you know what's realistic considering this shift?
Out here in California, we actually have not implemented the Common Core yet. It's something that we are going to be delving into this year and next year. So we're still using the state test, but I think that's going to be a big challenge for us next year.
In Louisiana, we are actually only half Common Core, half Louisiana standards, and we're in like a weird phase out, no one fully knows what's going on phase in our instructional lifespan. And so one thing we've really been focusing on, because there is so much ambiguity and the state does consistently change what they say is going to be on the test or not on the test, or what standards matters, what standards don't matter, is when we read through Common Core or the Louisiana grade level standards, there still seems to be like a common thread, and so really sorting through that and creating sub-skills that we know if we teach these sub-skills, our kids will be strong in each of their subjects and be able to be successful no matter who writes the standard or words it with whatever wording they want. As long as the kids have these foundational skills, they'll be successful, is kind of the approach we've been taking, because there have been so many changes across the curriculum in the past years.
Boston's in a very, very similar state as Louisiana, it sounds like. We're definitely phasing out the state standards and moving towards the Common Core, but it's something that we're definitely adjusting to right now, and I don't really know how it'll play out for our end of the year test, but hopefully we're preparing our students based on the combination and making sure that that standards don't kind of fall through the cracks.
Great. Love the honest, candid answers about how this is an unknown that we are all moving forward towards together. So here's another question for the group. When there's so much data to use, I've heard a bunch of you mention benchmarks and interims and exit tickets and essays and classroom observations and more. When you've all of this data in different places, how do you group it into manageable chunks for analysis?
This is Elizabeth. One thing we've done is we export everything into Kickboard, and we make sure that teachers code it a certain way. So for a while, like a benchmark, the standard for one question might be a different standard, even though it's the same concept as on a homework and that sort of thing. So being really intentional about how we code things and really breaking it down into little pieces, so that way when we look at homework checkouts, benchmarks, everything, they can all go into one system and we can just compare things that way. There was a much larger issue when we were using multiple softwares for grading and then keeping one grade book and then doing another grade book for attendance and that sort of thing. That really actually turned a lot of teachers off to even looking at data. So as much as we've been able to just put it in one central location has really made our lives a lot easier and the data a lot more comprehensive. And looking at skills over time and in multiple assessment types, as opposed to just like, oh, my checkouts are over here and my homework's over there and my benchmarks, around the corner.
And Elizabeth, to follow up on that, so I am seeing a couple questions come in about, sort of where Kickboard fits in all of this, and certainly as sponsors of the webinar, we're working, with panelists who are all using Kickboard, for a variety of different data management needs. But wondering, without going into too much detail, if you want to kind of add a little bit of color in terms of the role that Kickboard plays in helping you achieve your data and analytics culture on that day-to-day or week-to-week basis.
Yeah, I mean, to be really honest, it's been quite the struggle to transition teachers to Kickboard because it is so different than the traditional gradebooks we have used in past years. So the first thing we had to do was really be intentional about teaching teachers how to put grades in a way that would be useful in the future. So teachers would have an assignment that had lots of skills on it and they just put it as one thing and just call it like a fake blanket skill, and that's not really going to be ideal for them. So really pushing teachers to take the extra time to break it down, to code things in a way that is meaningful to them, that will give them information long term about the different pieces of a standard that students need to know. And then and there's just a lot of accountability around that. So lots of modeling and being really, really specific about how do I write, my weekly lesson plan. Okay, when I'm writing my weekly lesson plan, how am I going to put it exactly into Kickboard so that my data is actually useful? And really, really coaching teachers through that, modeling it for them, and then going into their Kickboard account and actually checking to make sure on a weekly basis that they're using sub-skills, that they're really coding it in a way that's going to be helpful. And really just with practice, it has become a lot more second nature to our teachers just over time, but it was definitely really difficult in the beginning. Once we've gotten teachers comfortable with that, we make all of our benchmarks in-house, and we grade them using EduSoft, and then we just export them into Kickboard, and we just make sure that the way we assign the sub-skill on our exit tickets and our checkouts and those sorts of things, it matches up what's on the benchmark so that we can compare that data. And we found that the biggest issue we were having initially is teachers teachers would call something one thing one day and call it something else the next day because they're just making up titles, and so it was hard to compare data. So really it was just about creating a habit of naturally grouping things and really giving it an easy way to track it and attach one piece of information to another so you could see patterns. It does take a lot of work, but it is really worth it if you can really get teachers invested in it and willing to put that work in on the front end. They really tend to appreciate the information they can get from it.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Elizabeth. And kind of zooming out and maybe pulling another question from the audience, it's related, and I'll direct it to all three of you. Along those lines, Elizabeth, I heard you say, there was a mountain to kind of surpass or overcome at the beginning of the year, and now teachers are really benefiting from all of this information. But I think the big question is, how do you get your colleagues to see data as a positive rather than a negative? Any of you are welcome to comment on that.
I think that's something that we're still working towards with not the majority of teachers, but a large number of teachers. It's definitely been a slow process to onboard teachers to data-driven instruction. How we have gotten the people who really value it now is by first of all modeling and the coaching and kind of showing them the process, and once they were able to see the benefits and the advantages of using that information for planning and how in a lot of ways it streamlined what they were doing and took a lot of the guesswork out, then they were kind of hooked. And then from there, actually, the more individuals that were getting involved and getting into it, it kind of spread, it kind of diffused out for us. So I think just focusing on the individuals that have the capacity first and are ready, and then being very intentional about how you roll out the rest of the work.
We've also been really intentional about providing professional development on the book Driven by Data by Paul Bambrick-Santoyo. We did a lot of work on that during our summer PD with our staff and actually read the book and delved into that. And I think that has helped with the transition to Kickboard because we really have that culture that data is important. And I think part of that is that the teachers are the ones who are creating the assessments. The teachers are the ones who are creating the pacing plans. And so nothing is coming from the top down. They're creating all of it. And so the data becomes much more meaningful to them when they have that ownership over the tests and the curriculum.
And just to agree with what Karina just said, I think one of the most important things is that it is coming from teachers and not from someone on high. I think that originally when we had some grumblings amongst the staff about like, oh, we're using a new way of tracking our grades, it's going to be standards-based, there was a lot of grumbling because it was someone telling us to do something and not really having to do it themselves, and it does take a lot more time and stuff, and I think we've had a whole lot more buy-in from teachers when teachers who do use data on a regular basis and have been very successful and are still in the classroom stand up and are saying, this is how I'm using data, this is why it helps me, this is why I feel successful, and this is how I know I can get even better. And just having teachers be the ones who model for other teachers how to use that data tends to be so much more powerful and creates such a greater buy-in than an administrator saying the same words.
I absolutely agree.
Along those lines, are there any specific things or color you can add to that about how you really build that colleague-to-colleague, what I like to call positive peer pressure?
Well, I think it starts, at least for me, in my case, I'm new this year, and it started with modeling and just showing that that it is possible to manage the time and kind of, you just have to be really strategic about it, and how you and kind of what your priorities are. And so I think for me, the first step was to use the system, to enter behavior regularly, to follow up on the assessment scores, and have conversations with teachers about their plans for next steps. So I think showing them that I was invested was the first step that I could take to have any impact or make a change.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. It looks like we are just about out of time. So I want to make sure that we thank everybody on the webinar, both our 3 very wise panelists, as well as just a great group of educators in the audience that have really provided a lot of thought-provoking questions, and want to make sure to just share a couple pieces of information as we close. So first thing is keep an eye out in your email box, as you will in the next day or so receive a free handout, a free resource on those must-ask questions to really build this thriving analytics culture, as well as a link to the recorded version of our webinar, which you're welcome to share with your colleagues and listen in if you missed any part of today. If you're interested in how Kickboard can help you and your school really foster this kind of analytics culture, please get in touch with some contact information here on the screen. And I also know that we have a few questions that we didn't get to today around how your existing Kickboard account can really help you, can really be configured to help you, build and grow this culture. So we'll be in touch with you if there are questions that we can help you answer. And certainly for the individual teachers that are listening in today, if you are a teacher that's interested in Kickboard within your own classroom, your grade level team, or your department, I encourage you to visit our website and sign up for the free Kickboard starter account, which is available for you and up to 2 of your colleagues to really build that collaborative culture. And so with that, I thank you again, and until next month, keep an eye out for our next webinar invitation, and thanks for joining us. Have a great day, everyone.